Welcome to the podcast for 1776 Forward.
We're the grassroots movement that's crowdsourcing activism for the cause of philosophical liberalism.
Stand up.
Speak out. Hello, everybody. We are back for our 1776 Forward podcast that we are starting to launch as our movement launches here. How you doing, Joia?
I'm doing well. It has been a crazy week, but I'm actually at this point, this is the best I felt since Tuesday. So we're recording this on Sunday post the election. And this is admittedly the best I felt since Tuesday.
Yeah, I would agree with that personally. Yeah, so I best day I've felt too. It's been quite a week. And we thought for all of our viewers and listeners that it was an important enough event to talk to as it relates to our movement, and especially as we're seeking to launch this this podcast series. For those of you who have read the manifesto and or listened to our introductory podcast that explains the manifesto and the goal of our 1776 Forward organization, you'll know that we talked about how Joia and I, when we were starting this organization and this activism project, that we had a real sense that 2020 was going to be a big apocalyptic year, and that was even before all the events of the crisis events of 2020 that none of us foresaw actually played out. So, and we always had a notion that chief among the big events in 2020 would always be the presidential election. And since it, calendar-wise falls at the end of the year, we always had a sense even before this year began that anything that did happen this year, including our project, would be aimed at that event. And so now, obviously, the 2020 U.S. presidential election has happened, and we just wanted to comment on it, because it did give so much form, at least as a event on the calendar and an event in the culture, and what it says about where we are as a culture to our movement and our organization. So, with that, Joy and I are just gonna frankly have a conversation, talking live, real time, about our views, emotions, and reactions and reflections on what's happened this week in the election and its outcome, and where it stands. I think we kind of even already, she and I have pulled out some short-term points of importance, that speak to the still moving events on the ground and the state of the election, its unsettled state, and some important ideas that we think are kind of implicated in that, and then as well as certainly some long-term principles that go to our philosophically liberal principles and values that are highlighted by this week's events and the election results, and then lastly kind of speak to kind of what would we like to see or hope to see going forward, kind of as a result of the election, and all of which is going to certainly be related to our 1776 Forward project. Joy, I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
I'll jump in and say, I'm really excited for this conversation because I think we're going to model what we hopefully continue to build here with 1776 Forward, which is the idea that we're bringing together people with different ideas and perspectives, but who have some commonality in that shared value of philosophical liberalism. But on this particular topic, I think it's really interesting because I think you and I do have some significant disagreements. So it's going to be really interesting to talk this through with you. I'll jump in and say that one of the ways I see this is, personally speaking, I have been a registered independent voter my entire life. But if anything, I've probably skewed more left. Interestingly, there have always been positions on the right that I thought were more correct and would have gravitated toward. There was a time when I would have said that I was socially liberal but fiscally conservative, although interestingly that phrase does not seem to apply anymore in the new political landscape of 2020. Mm-hmm. But if anything, perhaps on more policies, I had always leaned a little bit more left, and certainly personality wise. So I don't know if you're familiar with this idea that the big five personality, that two of those personalities, that there's a personality type towards openness, where people who identify as having the more open personality end up being more liberal, and there's another personality type that leans toward stability, and that those people tend to gravitate more toward conservatism. And certainly I've taken the personality test, and I am high, like almost off the charts on openness. People might know that
That doesn't surprise
my
me.
other work is all about lifelong learning and lifelong travel. So it's all about being open to new experiences and new ideas. So personality wise, I definitely lean more left leaning. But Chris, I think you've always leaned more right. Would that be a fair description?
Yeah, although and I haven't, I guess I'm not familiar with this model or this test. I certainly haven't taken it. And
Well, then I'm going to put the link so that everybody can take the test in the show
yeah,
notes.
that'd be
Because
great.
everybody should take the test,
Yeah,
and you
that's
should know
great.
your own personality. It's really interesting. So I'm going to put the link to that in the show notes.
Yeah, you definitely should. But and I'm just laughing because I'm like, I guess does this mean that I am not open? You know, I never conceived of my. No, I say that jokingly. I never conceived of myself that way. But certainly I could see the aspects of me that value stability as well. I mean, I guess I don't really think of it in those terms. And you know, this discussion is not really meant to be about Joya's and my personal political philosophies, you know, per se. So
Technically, it's not even just stability, it's order too. It's order and stability
okay,
versus openness.
yeah,
And order, I think, does very much apply to even what I know about you as a friend.
yeah, no,
How
that
you like to organize your life, I believe, is very orderly.
yeah, that's fair. So, well, then all the more now I'm even more intrigued. So please do share that link because I really want to check that out. But yeah, I mean, I guess the point is this is not meant to be, you know, an exposition on Joy's and my personal politics or anything like that. So, you know, I mean, you're right that I guess I have always been more right leaning for my own reasons, you know, which I'm happy to talk through individually with anybody who's listening and cares at any point in time. But I've never been a registered to either political party as well. So I've always kind of seen myself as more independent as well. But I think, you know, some of the things that you kind of might that I guess using that old formulation of socially liberal, fiscally conservative, that's how I used to think of myself as well, or maybe perhaps more libertarian. And for me personally, you know, issues on kind of the fiscally conservative side tended to take more importance to me. And so I think that's probably why I tilted more that direction. But like you, don't really kind of see myself fitting neatly on either side. And I think that's a big reason why we started this organization even. So, but yeah, I think that's a good grounding to your original point here, which is hopefully we hope to model even in this discussion and demonstrate to you that we're not, you know, Joya and I, not necessarily coming from the exact same sides either, but you know, how we want to work through it. And you know, a secondary aspect of this is just the value of talking these ideas out with other people, including people that you don't necessarily agree with on everything. You know, even just as the manifesto was clarifying emotionally and psychologically and philosophically clarifying and cleansing for you and I, as we sought to form our own version of saying no to the illiberal, yes to the liberal, and create a new form of liberal value in our own way. Having these types of conversations is a way for us to work through our emotions and our thoughts and reactions to current events. And so, you know, we hope that this again just serves as a model and a template for a lot of great additional content to come on any and all topics, which will hopefully be ultimately curated by you, the viewer and the listener, as you send us your ideas and connect with our podcast hosts to share your ideas and activities with us.
So let's dive in.
Okay. Yeah. So, you know, I guess we can start perhaps with you know, the state of play. We've, you know, it's Sunday, November 8th, I guess. The election was Tuesday, the 3rd. So we're now 5 or 6 days removed from the election itself. It's obviously, you know, I don't know about you, but me personally, 2020 was always going to be about the presidential election. We live in polarized times to begin with, and then no doubt the presidency of Donald Trump has further polarized, I think, the American political scene. Also, his dominance of all of culture has kind of made politics seemingly more paramount and every day in all of our lives, even when we didn't necessarily want it. And the media and kind of oppositional tit for tat in our culture of him and them back and forth has brought that to the fore. So we always knew that was going to be the case anyways. And then with all the events that have transpired this year, I felt that the election has always been kind of the underlying theme, if you will, or motif of every other event that was happening. So we've had our climax, and sure enough, it has ended in as unusual and chaotic of a climax as everything else this year or so, and everything else about seemingly our contemporary politics. So, I know I've had a range of emotions and reactions. Joe Biden, as of yesterday, was declared the winner by the media organizations based on the current counts in all the states. But President Trump obviously has not conceded the race yet. He and his campaign are alleging large-scale voter fraud, irregularities, extra legal deadlines and counting of votes that they seem to think anyways could be determinative in the outcome and could still make it flip in the other direction. So, technically, notwithstanding what the media is telling us and has provisionally said, the election is not settled yet. So it just adds to, the range of emotions and chaos that's following in its wake. But that's where kind of at least the state of play today on Sunday, the 8th. And so I think that's just further added to the heightened emotion. So, I think, the first point is even to just, and it's good that we're doing this now when you and I are both on our most even-keeled day since Tuesday's events to talk about it. But, I think perhaps the first point that both you and I kind of mentioned offline in our own private conversations on this is just the importance of having compassion for everybody, in whatever place and space they're in the aftermath of this election, given how emotionally and psychologically and politically charged and fraught it's been. I don't know, Joy, if you wanted to say anything about that or how you're feeling.
Exactly. So I'll jump in and say that people who know me might know that part of my background is I've been a yoga teacher. I teach meditation. This week, more than ever, I found it very necessary to really utilize those practices that help you self-regulate physiologically. And I think that's really important to mention now, that there has been chaos all year, and perhaps this week in particular. And for me personally, it has been a week where I've really needed to look inward and make sure that I'm caring for myself first, to make sure that then I can show up first as a calm, physiologically self-regulated person in the world. And when I do that, it helps me come from a place then of compassion, because from this place of calm, I can see the compassion for all Americans in this moment. And I think this is a nice tie to our project of 1776 Forward and what philosophical liberalism is all about, because part of philosophical liberalism is recognizing that that we are all unique individuals, and that there is a common humanity that unites us, and that simultaneously we can think of ourselves as members of groups. And it's interesting, I believe, in the moment when we're in, when the group identification is promulgated and pushed, it seems more than ever, to also recognize that we are individuals and that there is the common humanity that can and ought to unite us. And in this moment, I think it really is important to strive for that perspective of recognizing the common humanity and finding the compassion. So, speaking personally, I can say from my perspective that I can see why lots of people were not happy with Trump and are therefore happy with a Biden win. I can understand why lots of people were not happy with Biden and are therefore perhaps even grasping or really struggling with the declaration of the win that was made yesterday. And as an independent, I will say that I can definitely feel the compassion for all of us who don't really feel necessarily wide extremes of emotion for either side. So while I've definitely been riding my own kind of roller coaster, it wasn't the kind of roller coaster that would have been elated if one candidate won and despondent if the other candidate won. For me, the roller coaster has even been more the chaos of what's been happening and knowing that in planning for the long term, it would be helpful to have some kind of sense of where we're at so that I can start thinking personally about how I'd like to act to get us to where we're going, which would be different depending on the outcome, but is not ideal in either case. So that's how I've been feeling.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I guess so. Are you saying that your emotional roller coaster has um, been driven more by the continued uncertainty of direction that has been, I guess, willed by the voters in the outcome? And I guess that is, that the campaigns are still throwing up.
It has been interesting. So this is just even, as I start to self-reflect, one of the things that I've noticed that's happened to me just in the past day since we got the declaration yesterday, because as we're going to talk about in this conversation, there's definitely a part of me and my rational brain that knows that it's very important that we insist on transparency for this election process. And I'm going to put forward that I really do believe that from a bipartisan perspective, we should insist on auditing this election. I want to say I think we should all be able to agree that this was a very unusual election and that as a bipartisan sentiment, we should all feel that we should have an audit of this election to make sure that this process actually worked out correctly, regardless of what the outcome is. But I will also say there's a part of me that was just happy that there was maybe some kind of declaration and we could have sort of some place to put our feet and say this is where we're at in the moment and not have everything up in the air. So just even recognizing that within myself of noticing that, and interestingly, even though I am the personality type that likes things that are open and can generally deal with chaos, that in this particular moment, it was useful to just have something to hold on to and grasp onto.
Got it. Interesting. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm in that same place yet personally, but it certainly provides, a finality, of one form, if you will. So, but as we kind of talked about, just the current state of play is Trump is not conceding the election yet and plans to litigate it. So, and for everybody listening, and maybe perhaps for those who aren't clear, or if the point isn't obvious, notwithstanding the media's declarations, they do not, declare election winners in our system. There's a very, very clear, detailed legal and constitutional process for that happening, and that so long as there are disputes and the other side has not conceded, nor have state legislatures kind of signed off on the results, then that is still an open question. I think we're finding ourselves essentially in, for those who are old enough and were around for the 2000 election, we're essentially back in one of those situations, only times, depending on how many states you want to count that are going to be in dispute, times 3, 5, 7 times for all different states. So we're going to have to see how it plays out, but clearly at least, on the current count, Biden seems to be the winner. And so, so it's obviously very much up in the air, but I think the fact that Trump isn't conceding and that there are a lot of these questions around the total vote counts, given the uniqueness of mass mail-in ballot voting for this year and all of the last minute changes to state election laws and rules around that were created, that's the context and the atmosphere with which we find so much confusion and still dispute around the election results, and that Joia was referencing and saying we should all, on a bipartisan basis, want to audit the results of this election. I couldn't agree more. I think I'm probably personally more in that camp, rather than kind of seeing. Seeing yesterday's media declaration as definitive, and perhaps that's to some extent that's just because after the last 4 years of the Trump presidency, and the unexpected twists and turns, as well as the kind of uh, you know energy for fighting uphill battles that Trump demonstrates, I have no doubt that this is going to drag on a little longer. So, I'm kind of, I'm trying to take a more, I guess, cautious and measured approach as to what comes next. But we can certainly talk about, whoever is the final winner when all the court cases, election recounts, and state audits are completed. Whoever ends up the winner, we can talk about what the different implications of that are. If Biden's current win ultimately prevails, or whether certain states flip back after all the process plays out and Trump ultimately hangs on. We can certainly talk about that. But for now, I think the immediate short term is just what to do about this dispute, right? And how do we make sense of it going forward? And I guess for me, part of the emotional roller coaster, and perhaps some of the I guess what's the right word, disappointment in kind of I understand, as you said, kind of the elation of those who kind of the partisans for the Democrat half of the country who wanted to get Trump out and see Biden win. There was a lot of elation yesterday for that media declaration. But given how much is in dispute, and then knowing how the 2000 election played out, where it was, I think people were a little bit more cautious with kind of their description of it, given that Al Gore at the time was the disputer in that situation. I guess what's just disappointing to me is to see how quick to dismiss and close out any consideration or conversation of the disputed events around Tuesday's election by the media and by many partisans on the left is. And so I think that goes to your point. Like, we both agree wholeheartedly on the need for a bipartisan audit. And I guess one of the first question, or one of the first questions of our conversation is whether we're going to get that. And based on what I saw yesterday, and how the narrative seems to be kind of rolling out, just frankly, the fact that it is all about narratives rather than kind of stating the state of play like we are right now by many in the media who we trust to inform us, that's what disappoints me and gives me doubt as to whether we're really going to get bipartisan agreement and consensus around this issue.
I totally share that worry and concern, and it ties into, I think, another aspect of the situation we're facing that I also find deeply troubling, which is the state of our media. And to your point that we're both getting a lot older, and I am old enough to remember when it was at least a stated ideal and seemingly in practice that the media was supposed to be above the fray. The media was supposed to be the institution that allows us to question the government. And now it seems there's just fake news on either side. And so even trying to figure out how we could have that bipartisan consensus, that ideally it should be the media that stands in as our representatives and allows us to have that. And instead they're the exact opposite. They're the ones who are declaring the election on behalf of one candidate or the other. I think everyone can agree that the media has not been favorable to Trump throughout 4 years, that the mainstream media has a bias, and it's unfortunate and it's scary. And then I think this will go get into our conversation of what can we start to do about that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's three things. This is kind of the first bucket of our conversation that we laid out at the outset. Kind of the short term, just state of play of the current events, and some of the important themes that they implicate on. And I think given the dispute, but the fact that at least half the country seems to think there isn't a dispute, or that there's no merit to that dispute, I think it speaks to two important points of both the importance of process and more broadly and deeply rule of law, which is ultimately process, and then as well as one of our themes in 1776 forward of the importance of free speech, open debate, and inquiry, and um, uh, critical questioning and inquiry, curiosity when there are irregularities, anomalies, extraordinary circumstances that make things not normal. So regardless of, I think the point on bipartisan consensus is that, in my view, the rational and kind of objective analysis of 2020's events and 2020 election, and how the process of our 2020 election played out, would acknowledge and take into account the context that it wasn't a normal election. It was, because of the pandemic, we had way more early voting, and even more particularly, way more mail-in voting than we've ever had before. In fact, pretty much every state changed their laws, or at least kind of in the executive agencies that enforce them, kind of made exceptions to their laws to allow for much broader mail-in voting, kind of on the premise that, given the pandemic, wanting to keep people safe and not have to feel that they have to go to a polling place in order to vote, et cetera. And while that is obviously a good goal and premise, that we want to still uphold and maintain everybody's right to vote and not feel that they have to make such a stark choice between putting their health and safety at risk versus exercising their right to vote. You can't talk about this election out of context, that the fact that the way in which we voted this year was completely different than every other year. And in fact, that there have been dozens of legal suits brought by partisans on both sides to try and change those laws and make them more favorable, let's be honest, to their partisan advantage. So, without even commenting per se on the merits of each side's cases, I think particularly whenever it's political parties, political parties or aligned activist organizations filing these lawsuits and pushing these changes on laws, I don't think any of us should be naive or disabuse ourselves of the notion that they're doing it wholly altruistically, for just kind of expanding the vote, but rather, for ways in which they might be able to gain advantage on that. So, I think even just acknowledging that context of the extraordinary nature and circumstances of the way in which we counted and collected ballots this year, any fair-minded person would have to acknowledge. And then, given the importance of ensuring that everybody in our country, in a self-representative, self-governing republic, accepts and respects the results of the outcome, that in that context of an extraordinarily unique and unusual way of voting, that even if it's not probable, it's potential for additional incompetence, error, human error, and or fraud, right? And that's the context in which and frankly, for all of us who watched the election results play out on Tuesday and then on Wednesday and then on Thursday and Friday and ultimately till Saturday, till even the media couldn't even call it. Notwithstanding the problems of where the media is today as a neutral arbiter and describer of facts on the ground, given the way all that's played out, again, I would think any reasonable observer would look at that and say, you know what, for the benefit of the country and everybody accepting these results, this was so different and so unique and frankly so close. Either way, whoever wins, it's going to be on a razor thin margin, in terms of the electoral college and the states that will tip it over the electoral college, the margin of vote share in those states, that we all should have an interest in that. And the fact that you're already seeing not only expectedly, I guess you could say, many Democrat partisans, but also kind of the media just dismissing these concerns outright and just trying to, say, nope, it's everything's all above board, nothing to fear, concern, trust the process, without acknowledgement to the fact that there was no process, at least, as it normally and as it legally has been laid out, I think is a disservice to, and ultimately will be very damaging and destructive to the country and to its cohesion and acceptance of these results, whatever they are, if we don't audit this process.
I think that is well said. So should we start discussing the long-term implications and maybe what it is we can do to make some forward progress? Is there anything else you wanted to say about the short-term implications?
No. Yes, certainly. Do you want to kick it off?
Sure. So to start even by talking about the processes we have in place, this is maybe even a great moment to reflect back on our goals with the organization of 1776 forward, and thinking back to 1776, or at least the founding era, that we are ideally a government of laws and not of personalities. And part of the brilliance of our system, as the founder saw it, was to balance the powers. And part of what we're seeing is the erosion of that balance, unfortunately. And so that's one of the biggest, I think, objectives we ought to have for the long term, is recognizing what was good about that ideal of the balance of powers and what we can do to insist on the value of that and to champion that ideal for our government, to really stand up for that and insist on that notion. And then also the principles of free speech, freedom of press, that it seems we're really struggling with in our current culture. So the necessity in the long term to stand up for those ideals. And I like to sum it up in thinking about the value of independent thinking. And that's something I really hope that we explore in depth as part of 1776 forward, that if we're really going to make a cultural transformation, because I do believe that if we're going to make real political progress, that yes, there are these short-term considerations, but we want to think about the long-term effects that we can have. And a lot of that is in terms of the culture and in terms of education. So I hope we can stand up and champion the value of independent thought, and even start to think about how we can model that in the current climate. So for me personally, I know it's been an active process of not just getting swept up in what the social media feed feeds you, in actually being proactive about checking sources on both sides and being that your own center of independent thought, who's not just going to be swayed by what one of the sides, which clearly has an agenda, will want you to believe.
Agreed. I think to that point, that even implicates on the, our earlier point about the importance of a free press as an institution that helps us, I liked how you put it, kind of navigate these issues and hold government accountable. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts. Perhaps you've already jumped ahead to the answer of my question, but if you have any thoughts of how even if it's just sharing how you're navigating, the current events, in terms of how people should make sense of it, given the state of our press. And maybe the answer is by being independent thinking, right? And avoiding kind of the social media echo chamber, and self-reinforcing silo, or bubble that it is, we know, by at least technological design and perhaps psychological design, if not, if not ideological design, to reinforce those bubbles and echo chambers. How should people make sense of it, and how are you making sense of it? Because I know, for me personally, you know, I that's what I'm having to do as well. I don't, the mere fact that you're not even seeing in kind of mainstream media sources much discussion of, the fact that there's even still the election's even still in dispute, and that it's all just already onto, I mean, even just articles I'm seeing, of President-elect Biden and everything he's going to do, and here's all the people he's going to start appointing, and like that to me is a tell that the media has an agenda, which I don't think is a surprise to anybody. So for those who are trying to make sense of it, of kind of reality, what's kind of the best way to do it, and how you do that in an environment where, the media itself has kind of become an actor in our partisan battles, on both sides.
So I'll share that I have found this to be difficult. One point that I think is worth mentioning is that I don't think there was ever a time when the media was not biased. I think sometimes people look back and project a kind of golden age of Walter Cronkite, I think, is always the person that's held up as this neutral arbiter that everybody could trust. And as far as I see it, Walter Cronkite was a human being like the rest of us, and we all have our biases. So one of the ways that I think that's important to do this is to recognize that every individual does have their bias, but then when you're trying to figure things out for yourself, you want to make sure you're hearing voices that reflect a bunch of different biases. I think this even reflects some of our ideas about what philosophical liberalism is all about. It's recognizing that there's an objective reality out there, but we're all processing it individually. And the way that we do that best is to try to minimize bias as much as possible. And how to do that is even to look for what's common across biases. Now, unfortunately, to a certain extent, the media landscape has perhaps made that harder to do. I'd say for me, it's been a very conscientious, proactive pursuit that I've had to make to even start to pay attention to my feed and to say, wait, if I'm hearing too many voices on one side, I need to go out and actively see what are people saying on the other side, just to make sure that I'm getting a sense of from all different angles and hopefully being able to see what truth might emerge in spite of all of our biases. But it is a very difficult thing. And unfortunately, I feel it's becoming only harder and harder. Now, part of it is the rise of alternative media. And in a sense, that's what we're doing even with this podcast. We're making our contribution with this podcast to the rise of alternative media, alternative voices. So we are not reporters by any stretch of the imagination. And maybe hopefully we'll get some reporters on as guests, but that's obviously not Chris and my profession or our perspective. But it is an opportunity for us to present our opinions and bring on, hopefully through this podcast, people with a range of opinions so that we can start to hear the differences.
Yeah, no, I think the emphasis on proactive seeking of information and sources from across the ideological and or media spectrum is critical, because it's kind of both the, well, it's the, I don't know if paradox is the right word, but the double-edged opportunity and sword, if you will, maybe I'm mashing my metaphors a bit, of contemporary media and social media in particular, right? On the one hand, there are more media sources of information and so many easier ways to generate and disseminate information than ever before, which is obviously hugely democratizing and liberalizing in its own way. And both because it gives us access to more data on the world around us because more people can report on it, and share it, and also because it allows individuals like us the power to generate that content and share what we're seeing, directly as well, rather than through kind of media gatekeepers, when previously, just even the technology to get news or information disseminated widely to many people was such that you needed a lot of resources, and you had therefore corporations and other organizations that had to combine resources to do that, right? So that's like the positive, but then we see obviously the downsides of that, particularly in social media, in the feedback loop and the echo chamber. And I think we're seeing perhaps the consequences of that playing out now in our culture, in the growing tribalism and polarization between the two extremes, and two political parties, where it feels very much like people are talking past each other rather than with each other. And then certainly manifested in how we're all processing this week's events too. So I think this just goes to the long-term point that you were talking about of the importance of freedom of speech and press and information. And perhaps the answer really is that as more media proliferates, both more opportunities to expose the truth as well as to purvey fake news and untruths, that is going to perhaps put even more onus on the individual, not only to make their own judgments about what they're consuming, but frankly to be a proactive consumer themselves in order to get, because you know even if you're discerning and think you're judging independently by your own kind of estimation of the facts that you're reading and interpreting, if you're just taking kind of what your feed is spitting out for you, as kind of the facts that you're putting into your model, your mental model, and analysis, then you're probably not, given what we know about the algorithms and design of social media, you're probably not getting all the right information that you need to make an informed decision. And so that puts a more onus on you to go out and seek that.
I would absolutely agree with that. So should we then switch gears and now talk about the next steps, what to do next?
Yeah, sure. I think so. Some positives that I definitely take away from this week's results, no matter kind of the final outcome, is you know we spoke in our introductory podcast about how one of the things that Joy and I find encouraging and hopeful about this moment of 2020 that we are launching this project in is that there's a real way, it feels like anyway to us, that there's a real way in which Americans' political philosophies are up for grabs. That even as the two party system and the political tribalization and polarization seems to be growing, which seems to manifest on both sides in their own forms of authoritarianism, that most people are still not, kind of are resisting those two extremes, and that they are still a minority of the country and the culture. So, there's a very real way in which it feels like things are up for grabs and people's political allegiances are more fluid. That, I think, one of the key goals of 1776 forward is to help direct and channel that into a positive pro-liberty direction, because we recognize that's also a dangerous position, because it means people could get pulled more and more to either or both extremes, which will certainly be to the detriment of the philosophically liberal cause. But I do think the fact that given that moment, it's not surprising to me then that the results of Tuesday's election are such that you basically have a 50-50 evenly split country. And what that portends just about everything being up for grabs, and maybe an opening for us, to grab people's attention and to expose them and educate them in the ideas of the philosophically liberal cause, to hopefully give form to that. I think one thing we can definitely say of Tuesday's results is that, well, certainly people predicted Trump would do a lot worse than he did. They didn't think, it was Trump's going to lose in a landslide. It's a repudiation of all the, isms and negatives that have been flung at him by, his political opposition and media critics for the last 4 or 5 years. And lo and behold, it was almost in exact 50-50 split, and he got a record number of votes for any candidate in history other than Biden himself, right? So, I think that speaks to perhaps something of a backlash against, that effort to tar and paint him with all of those isms and negatives, what we might call woke culture, that's very cognizant of politically correct speech and kind of using or weaponizing it to silence those who don't agree with all of that speech, or don't agree with all the program that is underneath those who are pushing that speech. So that to me is one positive, but it also speaks to, while there may have been a woke rebellion, do people really know what they're positively for yet, right? So I think that's a sign that this is up for grabs. I don't know if you have anything to say.
Well, one other positive I definitely see that you've essentially alluded to is that this has been a record turnout year for voters. So we're seeing that people actually care more. People are going to the polls. And there is perhaps then this possibility to seize on this interest and do something with it. To your point, that maybe what we've noticed is that this election, unfortunately, was driven by negatives, that people were not necessarily voting for Biden or for Trump, but voting against Biden or against Trump. That then there's an open question in people's minds of, well, what are we for? If I'm not for Biden and or I'm not for Trump, what am I for? And hopefully philosophical liberalism can be the thing that they can come to be for, because you and I would both agree that philosophical liberalism, these are the values and principles that have led to flourishing, abundance, freedom, not just the pursuit, but the actual attainment of happiness for more people than ever in history. And hopefully we can have discussions that take this cause forward and inspire people with a positive message of something that they can fight for.
I think that's exactly right. And, maybe to even pivot off of that further, I think in giving people a kind of a positive value to be for, we can kind of seize the moral high ground in our cause, because they're really, politics itself, as we know, ultimately does come down to a debate among the society of individuals about what values they want to see reflected, defended, and advanced through our government, right? And so it is a moral equation, and there's a very real way in which you see both sides kind of trying to seize the moral high ground, but as you note, and certainly they have their aspects of it, whether it's kind of the multicultural, kind of elevation of diversity and kind of uh, demographic, groups and perhaps minority rights. You might kind of summarize or classify the left and Democrat sides, moral high ground on the one hand, but then on the right, kind of whether it's religious morality or even just traditional morality, kind of that sense you talked about maintaining stability and order of what many people on the right half of the country feel is a system that they want to preserve and not upend and disrupt and subvert. Both of those I think are, well, what's interesting is they're both good values and they're not necessarily, unfortunately, we see our political system puts them as antipodes against each other, as false alternatives that cannot coexist, rather than what I would argue is actually the proper both and integration of both values. But nonetheless, I think in the most honest and benign interpretation of both sides moral argument, that's kind of maybe perhaps the driving or animating cause on both. And yet, as you noted, this election really wasn't about a positive kind of what people were for. I don't think there's any doubt that on both sides, even the drive up in turnout was more about voting against the other side. And certainly that was the language and rhetoric that both Biden and Trump used to mobilize their coalitions. So there's a real way in which while they're groping to articulate a moral high ground, neither of them certainly seized it, right? So I think it's in that context and opening that philosophical liberalism really has a positive vision of something that we all can be for. And that really draws out, as we talk about in our manifesto and in 1776 forward, what we see as the real alternatives of freedom versus authoritarianism.
Exactly. I think that's beautifully said. And so I guess just next steps for people watching this, I would say that if people haven't yet seen our introductory video where we really go into depth about what we think philosophical liberalism is all about, also read our manifesto. That introductory video is kind of a layering on top of the manifesto. And I hope people will explore those documents and then get involved with our grassroots movement. That what we are trying to do here is crowdsource examples of activism from diverse people with truly diverse ideas and thoughts, and that this is how we can all grow and actually put our attention and our efforts towards something positive. And I will say that for me, even that has been incredibly healing during this year that has been so chaotic and unusual, that just the work that you and I have been doing to gear up and launch this project has been so important to me, to help me have that positive vision of something to be working for in my life. So I'm just excited to open this up now and share it with everyone else and actually take this to the next level, start a movement, get more people on board with building something positive.
Certainly. And even this conversation, I think, has further helped me in that aspect too. So we encourage all of you to, when we talk about our kind of three broad or general planks of what you can do for the philosophically liberal tradition and advancing these positive values, have these conversations in your own life with people, perhaps proactively even seek out people who have a different view, but approach them in a compassionate manner, understanding where they're coming from. Start perhaps one useful principle that I try and take in having conversations with people who I know probably don't agree with me on things. It's actually came from something you said to me a long time ago, Joia, is taking people on their own terms, and starting there as a basis for a conversation to share your views on an issue, or beliefs, and to hear from there. So, even replicating what Joy and I are doing right now in this podcast in your own life with someone in your own life, if that's therapeutic for you, if it's beneficial to you working out these ideas and coming to terms with this week's events or this year's events, all of that is useful. And if it sparks new ideas or your own activism projects, then by all means, please do share those with us. And, as we seek to continue crowdsourcing, all of your ideas and sharing them with everybody to inspire people in our in our own activist network here.
I think that makes a perfect conclusion for this conversation. I'm looking forward to seeing what we're going to hear from other people.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for your time. Great to speak with you too, Joia. I guess I'm sure there'll be much more to say on this topic, for all of us out in America in the weeks to come. But we look forward to seeing everybody in the next podcast conversation. Look out for the next topics.
Bye, everybody. See you next time.
Take care.
Thanks for tuning in. If you'd like to join in the conversation, you can become a member for free and join our 1776 Forward community on locals.com. See you there.